This story happened back in the 90s to my parents during their senior year of high school. Since their group of friends already had cars, the favorite thing they loved to do was night hiking around the state's local mental hospital, mainly to its old dairy farm. This was located on the side of a mountain, surrounded by agricultural fields and an open grassland. Since the dairy farm was not close to the mental hospital and the nearest city life was located about 5 miles away, at night, the area was extra dark and quiet. Before the dairy farm was closed down, the patients from the mental hospital would go there for work. During this time, some patients lost their lives at this location due to accidents. By the 90s, it was abandoned and left like a ghost town of its own, especially due to its rumors of being haunted. It made the perfect place for a fearful experience. So this particular night, around 2 in the morning, my dad, mom, 4 of their female friends, and 1 male friend planned to go to the dairy farm. They took 2 cars, and when they got to the usual parking spot on the side of the mountain, they saw that there were already a group of 20 people standing around their cars. When my parents and their friends got out of their cars, they noticed that the group of men all had shaved heads, were Caucasian, and in their mid-20s. As my parents walked past them, both groups ignored each other and avoided making eye contact. However, my mom turned her head to see one of the men, and as she did this, the man pulled back his jacket and showed he had a pistol tucked in his pants. Then he pulled back his lower lip, which revealed he had KKK tattooed on the inside of it. When they were out of hearing range, my mom whispered to my dad, "That man has a gun, and he has KKK tattooed on his lips." My dad brushed it off, thinking my mom was over-exaggerating and said it was too dark to even notice those 2 things. So with that, my parents and their friends walked through the grassland to get to the dairy farm. The hike to get there is about half a mile from where they parked, however. As soon as they got to the farm, they heard gunshots coming from the direction of the cars. Fearing that something happened to their cars, they booked it back to the parking lot. When they got back, the group of men were already gone, but as they inspected their cars, they saw that all of their tires were slashed and their windows were broken and smashed. My dad, who used a particular colored blanket as a seat cover, and his stereo were both stolen. Now they just stood there by their cars, wondering what to do next. It's not like they could just call someone for help. Nobody had a cell phone, and since they were too deep in a secluded area, they could not flag someone down for a quick pickup. The nearest gas station with a payphone was 5 miles away. Both my dad and his male friend didn't want to leave the cars alone, since they both drove classic cars and they feared that the men would come back. Eventually, it was decided amongst them that sending both males to run to the payphone was the best option, leaving the women by themselves with the cars. This was because they feared that the shaved head men were waiting down the road, expecting them to walk to the payphone. My dad and his friend ran to the gas station. As they left, my mom and her friends gathered heavy rocks and they used some sort of protective weapon and then hid in the bushes and behind the trees. 2 hours had passed when my mom noticed headlights coming down the road. 2 tow trucks rolled into the parking spot. An immense fear spread throughout the group until they saw that out of the tow trucks came my dad, his brothers, and the friend. They hooked up the cars to the tow trucks and were out of there in a matter of minutes. My dad told my mom that as they were running down the dark and empty road, they kept their eyes open just in case the men were hiding with their car lights off. Luckily, they got to the gas station without a problem. This next part may be hard to believe, but it's 100% true. 2 weeks had passed, and my dad managed to get his car fully repaired and drivable again. My mom and dad were driving to the local store, where they parked and got out of the car. They were walking into the store, and a man was walking towards them. As he got closer, my mom realized that this was the same shaved head man who flashed the gun at her. My mom immediately told this to my dad, but just like the first time, my dad denied that this was true. Then, 2 weeks later, at the same store, my mom and dad were sitting in their car while my mom saw a car pull up next to them. As the man got out and just stood there by his car, she quickly noticed that it was the same man from before. My mom immediately told this to my dad. Again, my dad denied it, but my mom looked into the man's car and saw the very recognizable colorful blanket that my dad used as a seat cover. This was when my dad finally connected the dots and got out of the car to confront the man. But the man, realizing what was happening, jumped back into his car and drove away. They didn't have time to get the license plate. The next week, when my dad was filling gas into his car, a car pulled up right next to him, and lo and behold, it was the same man. My dad immediately got into the guy's face, ready to confront him, but the man's friends got out of the car, and one of them pulled out a gun. The man with the gun told everyone to get inside the car, and that group drove away. It has been almost 30 years, and they have never seen those men ever since. To this day, my parents still wonder if those encounters were a coincidence or something more sinister. When I was younger, every year for Christmas, I would drive upstate to my aunt's house along a stretch of highway. I cannot for the life of me remember the name of this road. All I know is that it runs near Akron, New York at some point. However, most of the drive is through rural areas with little to no towns nearby. So it was the dead of night, and my groggy self had gotten off a long shift and had to drag my ass to my aunt's house since my extended family was expecting me the following morning. Near halfway through the drive, I realized I was low on gas, which irritated me. My brother told me he had filled it up the day before, so either he forgot or was straight lying. I saw an archaic-looking sign for a gas station off the next road. It wasn't an official road sign, literally a pole with a slab of metal attached with "Get off the next exit" or something along those lines painted on. That seemed a little sketchy, but people do the same thing with fruits and stands on highways, so whatever. I pulled off the next exit on some dilapidated country-ass road through dense woods. The whole thing was creepy and surreal. I kept expecting Leatherface to come running out of the trees with a chainsaw. Anyways, eventually I came to the gas station and realized quickly it hadn't been open for years. It was all rusted, and the convenience store's roof was caving in. The gas pumps had been all taken out as well. I pulled over next to it and checked my gauge. I would probably only make it another half mile before running out, so I called AAA and they said they could send a truck over. Now I played the waiting game. I left my engine on because when the headlights were off, everything was pitch black, and my paranoid self wasn't sitting next to an abandoned gas station in the middle of the forest in complete darkness. So, most of the wait went uneventful until I sensed movement around the side of the store where my lights are pointed. I look up but didn't see anything more, so I looked back down at my phone. Then, over the sounds of the night, I hear someone yell, "Hey buddy, come here," in a demanding tone. I look up, and I shit you not, there's a dude standing by the old store, looking towards me, illuminated by my headlights. He looked like a run-of-the-mill homeless guy. I was honestly spooked and figured he must have been squatting there. Still watching him, I rolled down my window and yelled something like, "Yeah, what's up?" Still mentally crapping myself. I had my foot ready to floor it out of there at the first sign of trouble. "You got any change?" "Nah, I don't. Sorry, man." I look up at him. He has this kind of vacant expression and is standing stiff. Then I see more movement. There are heads. About 20 or so heads peeking through the trees beyond the man I'm talking to. I can't see them clearly at all, but they are definitely people, literally just heads, staring in my direction from around the trees. I see another guy beginning to walk from around the gas station, and then I turn around and speed off. I got as far away from that place as my tank could carry me and updated AAA on my location. The driver came back over and filled me up, and I didn't say anything. But after he left, I wanted to call the cops, so I called the nearest town's sheriff department. They said they'd send a trooper over, and I gave them the location. When I got to my aunt's house, they called me back and said whoever was there was gone, but they could tell a large number of people had been living there for a while. Blankets, canned food, the usual. The whole situation still freaks me out, but frankly, I can consider myself lucky I always have such a creepy story to tell. I'm just glad nothing bad happened. So yeah, into the creepy dudes at the gas station. Let's not meet. This happened a few years ago. I was a teen. I grew up on our family ranch in the middle of nowhere in the southwestern United States. It was a very high elevated area where the Rocky Mountains stand proud, towering over beautiful green plains. Our ranch is about 20 minutes away from a tiny 100-person town, just to give you an idea of how isolated the area was. Some family friends were getting married one icy evening. My family was gonna go to the wedding, which was in another town about 45 minutes away. I didn't want to go because my favorite NFL team was playing that night, so they went to the wedding and left me at home. I was sitting at home, watching the game with my dog. I remembered that I had forgotten to close the horse barn door, so I put on my jacket and grabbed my rifle in case I ran into a bear or cougar or something. I went to the barn and closed the door. As I was walking back to the house, I heard the sound of a truck engine traveling through the mountains. I thought, they can't be back so early. The dirt road to get to the ranch winds around a hill just before it gets to the house and barns, so you can't see who's coming until they're up on you. I went home and grabbed as many weapons as I could and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I turned off the lights so that they wouldn't know that someone was home. I looked out the window that was looking towards the dirt road. A few moments later, I saw headlights coming up the road. I got away from the window so that they wouldn't see me. I saw the headlights were shining through one of the house's windows. I prepared for the worst and waited. After a while, I saw the headlights disappear and I heard the truck engine turn off. I heard footsteps walking around the house a few times, stopping near windows and doors. He even tried to open the door. After a while, the creepy guy went back to their truck and left. A police report was filed, but they were unable to find out who it was. I'm a female, and this happened 12 years ago when I was 16. Back then I lived in a small town where most people lived out in the country. Around 12 a.m. on a Saturday, I'm dropping my friend off after a night of hanging out. This friend lived way out into the country, and to get there you had to take a lot of winding roads with nothing on either side, and not many people traveled on them. There were a few houses, but most of them owned a lot of land, so they were majorly spread out. I always hated dropping her off at night because driving back was always super creepy, probably because I have seen way too many horror movies and to know what can happen out in the middle of nowhere. But it was my turn to drive that night. After dropping her off, I'm super careful not only because of my irrational fear, but because of drunks who won't take the curves well. I turn left on the last small street before I get to the main road. And this street has two major curves that you have to take slow since they are pretty wide and almost back to back. I'm coming up on the first curve, so I'm slowing down when I see three people dressed in all black, walking and blocking the whole lane. It was frustrating at first because I thought they were just teenagers not thinking of the dangers of what they were doing. So I sped up to hurry and pass them in the other lane before a car coming the other direction hit me. As I'm passing them, I look out my window to get a glimpse of the idiot teenagers' faces when I noticed all three of them are wearing the same creepy gray skull mask, and they all stared at me as I passed them. If it was close to Halloween, I would have passed it off as someone getting into the spirit of Halloween, but it was around May when this happened. The weird thing about the situation was it didn't seem like they were trying to run me off the road or cause me harm. They didn't even look behind them when I first pulled up on them. The whole situation was too weird, so I called the police. They called me back pretty soon after and told me they had sent someone to the exact location where I described and said they found nobody walking on the street, or even on the side of it. What creeped me out about that is that there is nowhere the three people could have hid because this street had open land on both sides. There were also no side streets that they could have turned on to evade the cops. They had to have been picked up by somebody or knew of a good place to hide. Either way, I knew what I saw were actual people and not something I made up. I have no idea to this day what those three people were up to, but I told my friend that if she wanted me to drop her off again, it needed to be before dark because I never wanted to find out what their intentions were. This happened almost 25 years ago, way before cell phones were a thing. When I was 17, and my brother, 13 at the time, were traveling in northern British Columbia in mid-November. We were in Pine Pass between Chetwynd and Prince George, BC. Anyone who knows this area knows how desolate it is. I'm talking hundreds of kilometers between gas stations and any kind of people and buildings. We were just about at the Power King ski resort turnoff, and it was getting late. We pulled into a roadside, turnout around 10 to 10:30 p.m. because I was super tired. My brother was already sleeping. I pulled in and parked near some tourist signage, locked my doors, and put my seat back to sleep. I was dead asleep when something snapped me awake. To this day, I'm not sure what it was that woke me up. I was looking around, trying to figure out what was happening when all of a sudden, my car was surrounded by 4 or 5 men. They started yanking at my door handles, trying to get in the car. I'm not sure if they saw I was awake or not, but I sat up, slammed the car in drive, and peeled out of there. I'm not sure if I hit one of them or not, and I didn't care to check. I didn't stop again until my auntie's house in Prince George. This was one of the most terrifying times in my life. So, to the 4 or 5 men in Pine Pass who tried to get into the car with 2 kids, I hope I ran at least one of your feet over. I was heading up to Clear Lake, California to visit my dad when he lived in Glen Haven, a sleepy little burg on the east side of the lake. I drove up from San Jose super early in the morning to try to get there around 5 to 6 a.m. so we could go fishing. I hadn't seen my dad in a few years. We were never really close, but I thought to try and reconnect with him again. I drove up 80 to 505, then cut down 16, which eventually leads to 20 onto Clear Lake, just for some reference. 16 cuts through several small towns, by an Indian casino resort in the middle of nowhere, and sides up along Cache Creek until it dead ends at 20. It's dark as fuck outside of the little towns. Somewhere near Valley Vista Regional Park, I came across a strange scene. It was about 3 a.m. There was a slight curve to the right coming up ahead, about 1/4 of a mile. On the other side of the road at the curve, I could see a bunch of cars parked haphazardly in the dirt between the road and the creek. The closer I got, I could see people standing around the cars. No lights, no fires, no flashlights, just a bunch of people, about 10 to 15 of them, standing around their cars in complete darkness, with the exception of my headlights. As I got closer, a couple of the people, from the shape-appearing male, started coming into the road and started waving their arms for me to stop. I was tired, couldn't make them out clearly in unfamiliar territory, with a bunch of people standing around in complete darkness trying to get me to pull over. I noped out of there with a quickness. I had a cell phone, but out there I had no reception, and I didn't call the cops once I did. It just felt all wrong, and I've always had good instincts. This still gives me the heebie-jeebies looking back all these years later. My family and I were driving from Ohio to Wyoming one holiday season to visit my family about 10 years ago. Due to storms farther north, we traveled west instead of northwest at first and split the trip at Omaha, staying the night before heading up through Nebraska into South Dakota. Once we were far enough north, we turned west onto I-90. At that point, it had been over an hour since we saw anywhere that might have had a public restroom, and we were on state routes, so no rest areas. Those of you who've traveled with a young kid know that's close to their bladder/boredom's limit, and our daughter was begging to stop somewhere to pee. South Dakota was similarly deserted, or even worse as we headed west. Finally, we reached a desperately needed rest stop, as my at the time 5-year-old and I both needed to pee by then. Just as we pulled in, the truck that had been following us for a while pulled in too. I didn't think much of it at first, until I started to open my door. My head was turned to the right, where the truck was parked a couple spots over. My eyes met the driver's, and I just shivered. He was a skinny white guy, straggly gray-brown beard, and dark eyes. I could see that he was wearing a dingy, dirty blue plaid shirt. He got out of his 90s brown and cream truck and started rummaging in the bed. I told my husband I didn't want to go into the rest stop alone because of this guy and the weird feeling I got from him. He thought I was being a little silly, but agreed to come in with us. At that point, the next stop was Wall, South Dakota, about 100 miles away according to the huge billboards we'd passed advertising it. He figured he'd better empty his bladder, even though he didn't particularly feel the need. I grabbed our daughter and we headed inside, followed by the guy who'd finished rummaging in his truck, but wasn't carrying anything when I glanced back. My daughter and I did our business in the women's restroom and headed back out to the lobby. As I expected, my husband was already out there since he didn't have a small human to chaperone. The old guy was also in the tiny lobby area. He was just standing there, staring at my husband. My husband rushed us back out to our car. As we were buckling in, he locked the doors. Then he told me that the guy hadn't even gone into the restroom and was just standing in the lobby the whole time. He agreed with me that we might have just had a close call, and he was glad that it hadn't been just me and our daughter in there. However, that's not the end of the story. Remember how I mentioned Wall and that it was 100 miles away? Well, that was 100 miles of pretty empty landscape, but a decent number of turnoffs from the interstate. We didn't see the truck follow us and thought the whole episode was behind us. Except when we stopped in Wall to grab lunch and some road snacks, plus look around at this homey but fun little tourist trap in the middle of nowhere, we saw the guy in the store, not even 20 feet from us. Same face, beard, dirty plaid shirt. Thankfully, we had already eaten, so since he was staring at us, again, we quickly paid for our snack and trinkets and got the heck out of there. Thankfully, we didn't see him again, but I was seriously creeped out until we reached our relatives in Wyoming, safely, with no other sight of that truck. My girlfriend, who is 23, and I, a 20-year-old female, were just vibing late at night on a Tuesday about 2 weeks ago in our apartment. We were having a good night, and it was about 3 a.m., so we decided to turn the TV off and try to go to sleep. Suddenly, there was a banging on the door. Our dog is flipping out, growling, and barking at it. My girlfriend and I are like, "What the fuck? Seriously?" We both look at the time, and it is exactly 3:02 a.m., so we are pretty freaked out by the aggressive banging. My girlfriend looks through the peephole and sees a very large African-American man just standing there. He looks to be in his late 30s maybe. She saw him more than I did, because I was really scared, and I only looked once. She yelled at him through the door, asking what he was doing, and he stopped knocking for a second, didn't say anything, then kept banging. Eventually, he gave up and went away at 3:06 a.m. After this, we were very shaken up, especially since we were two young girls, alone, without anything really to defend ourselves. We were too afraid to sleep, especially because our sliding glass door to our balcony doesn't lock. It's been broken since we moved in. We were so freaked out, thinking that, should we have called the cops? what kind of person does something like that at 3 a.m.? And I was convinced that if we had opened the door, he would have forced his way in and hurt us. We were just starting to calm down 2 hours later when it happened. We heard banging again. He was back. The time was 5:02 a.m. Again, I still think it's weird that he came back at the exact same time, 2 hours apart, but he kept banging. This time my girlfriend shouted more at the door, asking what he wanted. I was freaking out and cuddling our dog who was scared and whining. This time he started talking about if we knew some guy named Kyle on the 3rd story, and he kept telling my girlfriend we needed to open the door because he couldn't hear us. At one point, she touched the lock by mistake, and he seemed to dart forward really fast. Eventually, she shouted for him to go away because it's the middle of the night, and he said sorry, then left. We were freaked out after that and thought we should have called the cops, but to be honest, we don't like cops because we are stoners with like a sheet of acid in the closet, so we didn't really want them involved, but we told our apartment front desk. We thought it was over, but then on Saturday, 4 days later, this guy came back again. This time it was during the day, around 11 a.m., so my girlfriend opened the door even though I was still scared and didn't want her to. He told us we were hot and he wanted to take us back to his apartment, and he watched us from his balcony all the time. He pointed to the apartment he lived in, which was across from us, and we could see each other's balcony. He sounded like something was wrong with him when he spoke, like he was mentally challenged or had a brain injury or something, but we told him we were lesbians and not interested and to go away. It's really creepy because we didn't see him on the balcony while we were smoking, staring at us for about 2 weeks before all this happened. We reported it again to the front office because now we knew where he lived, and they took the situation very seriously. They said they think they know who it was and that they couldn't say much, but he wasn't supposed to be there and isn't on the lease. They confront the lady who lives there and said that she knew who they were talking about before they even finished the sentence. She said she didn't want him there, but he wouldn't leave. She then sent an apology to us and said that he would leave immediately.